brilliant to see so many people here. And just very quickly introduce my fellow conspirators up here. Anne Leslie from the Daily Mail. I think it's fair to say is something of a doyen of foreign correspondence. She's been everywhere, as far as I can tell, and covered
occasionally
bumped into each other, and covered just about every interesting foreign story of the last several years. Peter Millar here is the author of 1989, My Part in His Downfall. Copies available here. Just get the advert in first.
I haven't brought any copies here because I'm very ditzy, really, and so are my publishers. But it's very cheap, my autobiography. Just go on to Amazon. It's called Killing My Own Snakes.
Yeah. That's price, not content, right?
Oh, no, the content is terrific.
Okay.
And quite funny, too, considering.
So Peter Millar and Nick Thorpe, he is correspondent in Budapest, and his book is called 89, The Unfinished Revolution, Power and Powerlessness in Eastern Europe. Too much for me to remember, so I had to read it. But that is also available here at a very reasonable price. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that Nick talks about what's happened since 1989 and the effects of the fall of the Berlin Wall, good and bad. And I thought what we do is if we just say a few words about, you know, where we were on November the 9th, 20 years ago or whatever, and then we'll just sort of have a discussion. That seems to be the best way to do this.
Yeah.
So I'll start, if I may. I'd been in Germany on and off for most of that summer, doing various stories, refugees coming over. Of course, the Hungarians took down the Iron Curtain with Austria. Lots of German refugees is probably the wrong word, but people travelling from East Germany, lots of stories, lots of human stories. We took one family called the Lehmann family, who were actually from East Berlin, and we took them from Passau on the border in the south, and we took them up to, I can't remember if it was Nuremberg or Munich, I think it was Nuremberg airport, flew them up to Berlin, and they had this incredibly emotional reunion with their members of their family from West Berlin in the airport, and I mean, I cry at sad movies, but I was just weeping, and I turned around to make sure that my cameraman Phil By, who's a hardened war cameraman, was getting all this amazingly emotional stuff as these two families, you know, branches of the families were running towards each other and embracing, and the camera was on the floor and he was leaning against a pillar crying his eyes out. So that kind of, for me, you know, set the tone for what happened over the next few days. It was a very emotional time. I was supposed to go from there to, I was going to go back down to Bavaria to do more stories of East Germans coming across and how the West German authorities were really not at all prepared for the numbers. But then there was a ferry accident in Hamburg or Hanover, I think it was Hanover, I think it was Hamburg, involving some British people. There was a hole the size of a bus in the side of this ferry, so we went up there. That was the morning of the 9th, and then we sort of, you know, by the evening things were stirring and we realised something was going on, something extraordinary was happening in Berlin, and we got down there as quickly as we could. And of course the next few days were incredibly emotional. And I think by about the 12th or 13th, within about 3 or 4 days, most of ITN, who I was working for at the time, had arrived in Berlin. You know, the news editor at ITN had a sign above his desk saying, well, the last one out, please turn out the lights, because the whole of ITN moved to Berlin pretty much. It was a very, very emotional time, and of course people, you know, over the next day or two were flooding across the checkpoints from east to west and having the most extraordinary experience. And there were a lot of, you know, it was a very emotional time, a lot of tears, a lot of red eyes. So fantastic experience, and then of course we went on to Czechoslovakia and Romania, but that's another story. And nowadays I lead a more sedentary life, being a political correspondent for Sky News, but back in those days I was, you know, causing a lot more trouble for ITN. Anne?
Yes, we were talking about weeping. I actually haven't tended to cry since I was about 17, which is about the time the dinosaurs died out of the way, because of eye makeup. You cannot cry with eye makeup. It runs down, you know, you end up looking like Alice Cooper, you know, these vampire things. Actually, that was the one occasion where I cried buckets. Now, I was actually in East Berlin illegally, in the sense that I had written mildly disobliging things about this workers' and peasants' paradise, and the joys of real existing socialism before, so I was always refused a visa. But that was quite simple, because all you did is you went to West Berlin, posed as a tourist, and I have 2 passports, both legal, I may say. I have been tempted sometimes, you know, in places like Thailand to buy illegal passports, but no, it's, on the whole, you try and get 2 legal ones. And I call the second passport my housewife superstar one, because it has no evidence that I'm anything else but a little housewife. And the then editor of the Daily Mail, because I never worked in the office, rang me and said, "And what do you think is going to happen?" Because we already had this thing with the Hungarian, you know, and everybody who was in the socialist family was allowed to travel freely. It was a kind of Schengen agreement for the Eastern Bloc. And I said, rather condescendingly, and I'd been in Tiananmen, you know, about 4 months earlier, and I said, you know, well, the East Germans have only 2 solutions. One is the Tiananmen solution. Gorbachev has said already, don't expect us to come in with tanks to save you. And he said to Honecker, who's then the boss of East Germany, you know, those who delay are punished by history. And also there were more Soviet troops in East Germany than there were East German troops. So I said, it's either going to be the Tiananmen solution, which I don't think they can do, and the other is, in some way or other, I said rather grandly, they're going to have to open the wall. But it won't happen very fast. Nothing happens very fast in communism. And he said, well, when can you go? And I said, well, I'll rejig my diary rather grandly. And I did rejig it. And my God, thank goodness I did. And I went over into East Berlin and contacted various people. And then suddenly, the whole thing was imploding. And one night, I thought, it's imploding so fast, I'd better get some accreditation. So I went round to the ministry, and the usual Rosa Klebb, who was there, who knew of me in the past, and I said, I'm here, and I'd like accreditation. And she looked at me very levelly and said, why not? This whole place is going mad. So she gave me accreditation. I don't normally ever go to press conferences because they're boring, and you know, unless you're on television where you're going to be, you know, on television asking the question of the great man. Not me. I've just come from a tabloid newspaper, tabloidish. Anyway, I thought I'll go. I thought, well, I'll go to. I said, anything going on? Apart from the fact that your country is bleeding to death because they were all leaving. And she said, well, Gunter Schabowski, Comrade Gunter Schabowski, who was the Politburo chief of Berlin and also in charge of propaganda, he's giving a conference. I said, what about? And she said, the forthcoming plenum. Well, you know, that's sort of going to knock you out with boredom. But I sort of thought, you know, because I was still a little bit jumpy about the Stasi. Was this accreditation, would I be yanked out? And so I went, but I'd been writing most of the paper for a week under different bylines. I was exhausted, so was everybody else at this press conference. In fact, the ITN man, double-barreled name.
Ian Glover James.
Yeah. He was fast asleep next to me.
You know, typical Glover James position. Nothing to do with exhaustion.
But we were very exhausted. I mean, I was working round the bloody clock. I'd been interviewing dissidents, I'd been doing this, that, and the other. And suddenly, Gunter Schabowski, the conference was going to end at 7 o'clock. Very Germanic. I knew it would end at that. About 3 minutes to, he was shuffling in his papers, and he brought out this bit of paper and said, oh, this might interest you. Well, nothing else had. And he then read out a slightly bureaucratic statement But the implication was, from now on, East Germans can escape. You know, you wouldn't have to have special permissions or anything. But, and I woke up in love with James. I said, I think the wall's coming down. You know what? And there was an Italian journalist who said, when? And Schabowski still, I mean, I've interviewed him many times since, and he's always denied he was drunk, although a lot of them were. And he said, sofort, as far as I know, immediately. So, of course, I belted round to, first of all, Checkpoint Charlie, because the East Germans were watching West German television. So they would have heard all this. And it was an extraordinary sight, because it was just like every spy movie you've ever seen. Border guards in greatcoats, you know, blowing on their fingers, and, you know, nobody there. And so I went up and said, you know, did you, and he said, well, we heard Comrade Schabowski's remarks on radio because they'd been listening. And we don't know, we're trying to get our orders. Because the orders had always been anyone trying to cross, sort of illegally, was shot. But there was something that had puzzled them, understandably, puzzled all of us. And they couldn't get through their superiors. I subsequently discovered one of their superiors was at the opera. None of them had expected this thing to happen. And as he said, well, as you know, nothing's happening here. So I thought, well, the East Germans are too frightened, and understandably. Then I went to Friedrichstrasse, you know, that station, which was another official crossing point. And it was exactly the same, old spy movie stuff. I thought, oh, well, yeah. And then I turned around, and I saw this tsunami of people coming. I mean, it really was. It started with just a few young people in what was considered very chic in those days in East Berlin, stonewashed jeans and Turkish leather jackets. And they were giggling in fright, partly. And then suddenly, behind them, this huge mass of people. And from then on, the whole place fell apart. The only trouble was, of course, well, not a lot of you, but some of you won't remember the Pleistocene era when there were no mobiles. And phones out of East Berlin, you know, into the West, were absolutely clogged. They were never very frequent anyway. And I was having to write on the wing and then get into West Berlin to file. So I went through one of the walls, the holes in the wall, ran to the Kempinski, filed. Then I had to get back in because I was doing a running commentary, rather like 24-hour news. And, you know, the hole that I had just climbed through was full of people. So I found myself shouting, where's the next hole? And, you know, and so it went on all night, and I was in one of the first cars, Wartburg, my friend, East German, and we drove through the death strip. And of course, the trouble was, I had thought that I should try and dress like an East Berliner, stonewashed jeans and cheap leather jacket. Still had all the slap on, of course, but, and when we drove through, the West Berliners were massed, endlich, you know, at last. And I started weeping, and I thought, do I say I'm actually not an East Berliner? I didn't for quite a while. Anyway, it was a thrill. But I have to say about this emotion thing, as I said, don't cry easily. I wrote this incredibly emotional stuff, and I rang my editor and said, look, it's over the top, but I haven't got time to sort of tone it down. Please, please, tone it down, you know, because it would look ridiculous. Yes, of course, Anne. He didn't. And Craig Brown, you know, who's a wonderful satirist in Private Eye, and he wrote a parody of what I'd written. He said, Jill Shrill, award-winning foreign correspondent. And it was very funny, and it was about the mascara running down my cheek. So I don't cry, ever since I don't, anyway.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. Nick, your reminiscences.
I would spool back the tape a year and a half or 2 years, because I think it was something of a mystery why the Hungarians let the East Germans out. And I think the real reason the Hungarians let the East Germans out across the Iron Curtain the previous summer, which of course led to the wall coming down, was nothing to do with the East Germans at all. It was more to do with the Romanians. Ceausescu's plan to destroy all 13,000 villages of the country, to bulldoze them, and the Hungarians, naturally with a large minority in Transylvania, whether they were in the fellow internationalist socialist camp or not, really couldn't tolerate that. And so the Hungarians getting active in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was going on in Vienna, initially too embarrassed to announce that they were going to try and help their fellow Hungarians from across the border. And I remember, if we're talking emotions, being in a church in late 87 or early 88, at a time when the Hungarian authorities couldn't officially help people fleeing across the border from Romania into Hungary, but the churches could. And the churches there got very involved, as they did, of course, later in the summer of 89, and helping the East Germans. But initially, the Hungarian churches, small groups who were initially helping drug users and alcoholics and the poor of Hungary, suddenly found themselves dealing with tens of thousands of refugees coming across from Romania. And I remember standing in the church there when Pastor Geza Nemet, the priest, announced, and today there's all refugees in a church, people camping outside, and we have a guest from the BBC, and the whole church erupted in applause, and then they sang in English, "We shall overcome." And again, I couldn't really hold back the tears.
But you weren't wearing mascara.
It's one of the features of that time, wasn't it? The role that the church played in
absolutely. The church in Leipzig, the Gethsemane in Berlin. Absolutely.
And also in Poland, you know.
Well, Poland, that was really
solidarity
important.
earlier. But I was in Leipzig, like you, I'd spent a bit of time in, actually in East Germany. We hired this Fiat Uno in West Berlin, hoping that we'd be as inconspicuous as possible, you know, rather than the thing we normally drove, which is a massive, great Mercedes. And we went and across the border, and we were the fastest thing on the road. You know, all these sort of trabbies going along with their two-stroke all-wheel engines, and we were doing sort of 50 miles an hour and passing everything. Anyway, thank you, Nick. Peter.
Yeah, well, I know Nick, of course, had lived a long time in Hungary, but I think with the possible exception of my wife here, I'm the only person in this room, unless please correct me, who actually lived in East Germany. Oh, well, hey, whoa, please, let's go on. Right, okay, that's very good. I will look forward to a lot of correction. But we lived there in 81, 82. In fact, it was our first marital home, and therefore, by the time it came around to 89, I don't know, perhaps the other people who actually lived there may have noticed. There's only one colleague here did tonight, and I'm actually wearing an SED badge and my lapel, which is maybe a bit heresy on a night like tonight. But ECD was, of course, the East German Communist Party. I'm wearing it not because in any way I supported the East German Communist Party, but because a chum of mine in a pub, I drank it in East Berlin, gave it to me to tell me he didn't really believe in the party either, but he had to join to keep his job. And so it's really in honour of him that I'm wearing that tonight. But the time we moved from East Berlin to Moscow in 83, and then I came back working for the Sunday Times, and was all over, obviously, all of Eastern Europe that year. I have to say that when the wall came down, which of course nobody had any idea was happening, nobody, even when it was happening, we didn't know that it was happening, we didn't believe it was happening, and we didn't believe it wasn't going to go up the next day. And I was remarkably dry-eyed because I thought, bugger, this is happening on a Thursday, and I work for a Sunday paper, and I've got to, I've got to sort this out. I'm not going to write anything tonight. I'm going to go and just do the experience, and I've got to start thinking about this Friday afternoon, which by the time I've got to put something together for the not just the front page, but for what's going to be a double-page spread on the inside. I'm talking journalistic stuff here, not just events, because it is also a job. On the night, I had actually almost missed the wall coming down because I'd be on the 7th of October, which was the 40th anniversary of East Germany. Honecker had held this big do, and then that's when Gorbachev, as Anne said, made that comment, if you come too late, you get punished by history. But there would be huge riots throughout the whole of East Berlin. And I was up in our part of Berlin, the part that I still called home, which was Prenzlauberg, now terribly shicky-micky Notting Hill. Then it was a bit like the sort of the worst bits of Tower Hamlets, and still with craters across the wall where the tanks had hit it. And in 1945, and I was nipping into my local pub to a phone copy across with, again, no mobiles, but in fact, by then, actually, nobody 10 years earlier, people would have been scared what you said on the phone line in case it was being listened to. But by then, the situation had changed. So I'd scribbled stuff on the back of an old credit card statement and dashed into the pub, lifted the phone and rang it through to London. Later that night, however, I was caught with everybody else around the Gethsemane Church, and we were thrown into police wagons, carried off singing the Internationale, wonderful. You know, we sang the Internationale against the People's Police. We sang People's Police stand by the people. You know, Volkspolizei steht dem Volke bei for the Germans. And it was a remarkable evening, but the result of it was, of course, that I was chucked out the next morning after 12 hours of interrogation by the Stasi, who took me back to my hotel room, the Grand Hotel, where I noted, I was quite worried because I actually had in my room documents of an East German friends who left the country 2 weeks earlier on the closed trains via Warsaw, and I was going to smuggle them over to the West so it would help them gain social security, because those things still mattered. I was terrified the Stasi were going to search the room, but actually we couldn't get my hotel key. And I discovered why we couldn't get the hotel key, which because a girl who had seen me being arrested, a British reporter, had, thank God, rung the Sunday Times, so I still got my own arrest on the front page, managed to get hold of an American guy who also reported it, and they thought, well, he doesn't need his hotel room for the night, do he? So when we knocked on the door, they were based in my bed. Sort of things that happened. So we got them out of my bed, and the Stasi were actually embarrassed by this, so they drove me to Checkpoint Charlie and threw me out without checking on it. 2 weeks later, there had been riots again throughout East Berlin, but I was worrying that I wouldn't get back. Nobody knew the war was going to down, so the Sunday Times had sent me to Namibia to cover the first elections. So here I am sitting in the Kalahari Sands bar in Windhoek with Dario Mitigieri, this Italian photographer, who's a good photographer. And he says, Peter, you need to stay here. It's a big story, big story. I'm thinking, oh, Dario, can I trust you on this? And I thought I'd been with Dario before on a couple of stories in Northern Ireland. And Dario said, please, Peter, you point out to me which one is Mr. Parsley. And I thought, no, Dr. Paisley, no. And in that case, perhaps Dario is not the man to trust. So I got on the plane back via London to Berlin, and thank God I did, because, that's when it happened. But actually, again, because, as Anne was saying too, nobody knew this was a dull Schabowski press conference. I was waiting for a Sunday paper. Was I going to turn up and listen to this on a Thursday evening? I went up to Rostock for a demonstration, one of the growing demonstrations. I'm coming back to Berlin, and suddenly I hear on the car radio that there's people gathering at Bornholmer Straße where guards are letting people through. I thought, this is bloody hell. The second is, why is this Mercedes 190, which I've rented from West Berlin, got such crap acceleration? I drive all the way back to Berlin, and of course I get to Bornholmer Straße, and I had friends around the corner who ran a bar there, and they couldn't go west because he'd lost his identity card. So he was sitting there making a nice profit from the people who'd gone west, and because they had no west marks, they all sort of wandered around for a bit and then come back and got drunk in the east telling the stories about it. But the old Prussian pedantry wouldn't let me through. So I went down to Checkpoint Charlie, and the border guards, who knew me, of course, because I'd lived there for years, and I knew them by sight, and there was a big, hairy bloke I'd always nicknamed Yogi Bear, and he said, yeah, hello, Peter, you can't get through, and I said, yeah. And these were the people, who everybody else had demonized. These were the guys toting guns, but actually, to me, they were just sort of, guys on the customs post. And he said, tell you what, mate, stick the motor over there and we'll look after it for you. And I walked through the wall and had my hair tousled, and people shoved a bottle of beer and said, Willkommen in die Freiheit. And that was, I actually entered it feeling like I was an East Berliner. And to end very quickly, I then waited until I thought I need a focus for my story here. So I wasn't going to go to the Brandenburg Gate, because actually nothing was happening. The people who all those great pictures, they were all West Berliners climbing on the wall. Those were not East Berliners coming through. So I hung around and said, I need a focal point. And about an hour later, after sort of watching the thing, I saw 3 giggling 19-year-old waitresses, and I thought, that'll do. So I grabbed them, we piled into a taxi, and wonderfully, they'd all actually been working in the Hotel Stadt Berlin on Alexanderplatz. But like good Germans, they'd stayed behind and finished their shift. Yes. They didn't. They said, oh, no, we can't go west yet, because we've got another. They were serving borscht to Russians. So we get through, and we go to the Kudamm, and I'm lending them Westmarks. They're ringing, hello, Mutti, ich bin am Kudamm. Hi, Mum, I'm in the West. And then, of course, extraordinarily, the 2 people whose documents I was had been waiting to smuggle out appear on the corner, because everybody met everybody. It'd be like Trafalgar Square. That's just where you ended up. And all of a sudden, her brother, whom she thought she'd never seen again, his fiancé, all met together. And we did what anyone would do in those circumstances. We just got completely drunk, and then at 5 in the morning we staggered east again, because that was home.
But that's the extraordinary thing. I mean, there was a friend of mine who was a surgeon at the Friedrichshain Hospital in East Berlin, which was a kind of monument to the two insane systems that had dominated most of Europe at one stage. It was a big general hospital, and the Nazis had made it into a shrine because Horst Wessel, who was a Nazi thug, who in the sort of various communist Nazi riots at the time, was shot by some communists, and he dragged himself into this hospital, and he died there. And the Nazis then made him a Nazi martyr. And Friedrichshain had preserved all the bullet holes of the firefight between these two rioting groups. So, in a way, it was a symbol of Nazism and a symbol of communism.
But did the Daily Mail insist that you got the Nazis into the front page?
No, no. Do you know, you don't read the Mail, so you don't know that when I was writing...
Do you know who doesn't read the Mail?
It was quite a serious paper. But a friend of mine who was a surgeon there, and in the week before, she was in despair because no ambulance drivers, because apart from the Trabi, people who were chugging like rusty lawnmowers over the border into Hungary, all the ambulance drivers had been taking their ambulances again across the border. No laundry people. She was having to do, no nurses. She was having to do everything, including all the laundry. And she told me that the bottom of her family house, she woke up as a child and saw overnight the wall had been built through her garden. And she said, you know, 28 years, every now and again I have this nightmare that I'm doing an operation and the wall comes down. And then when I finish the operation, the wall's gone back up again. And I managed to get hold of her, and I rang her and I said, Karen, it's down and it's not going up again. And she just collapsed, weeping. Now, of course, she's a very successful private doctor in West Berlin. But, you know, the wall in the mind and the wall in the psyche, which to a certain extent still exists between East and West Berlin, then, of course, it was there all the time. I mean, people like Karen, who was a good communist, etc., etc. But it was always that nightmare that the wall would come down because she'd grown up suddenly seeing it sprout in her garden. And it was very moving, you know. She was stunned. She said, are you sure it's not going to go up? I said, no, Karen, no way.
But we weren't sure that evening.
No.
I mean, you know, you came across the next morning. I staggered back through 5 a.m. And it was only then, as you got there, you started to see, now hang on, this is not too far.
Yeah.
Irreversible.
You know, this is irreversible. But we still didn't believe. And in fact, on the early morning of the next day, East German border guards were again stamping people's identity cards, saying you can go through, but we have to give you a stamp.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, maybe in 2 weeks' time,
I
what
don't
will
know,
those stamps mean?
Did you fear that there was going to be a bloodbath?
Not by then. I had feared it in Leipzig a month earlier when we were under the demonstrations around through Leipzig, and we all had Chenin men in our heads.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, I'd been there when Egon Krenz in Beijing congratulated the Chinese for putting down the counter-revolutions. That was only about 3 months
The day
later.
after the big Leipzig demonstrations, I drove, because I knew, having lived in East Germany all over the place, I knew the topography, not just of the cities, but I took a route from Leipzig back to Berlin and drove round by the outskirts of the Russian bases. I just thought, I'm going to just watch and see what happens, because, and they were there, they were just standing outside, and there was no sign of movement, because if there had been any sign of movement, that would really have been an indication. And we know now that Honecker actually asked Gorbachev, and he said, no.
No, you're on your own. But the other thing is that my fixer, an East German woman who was working with me, and when we suddenly saw this tsunami beginning, she said, I'm sorry, I'm going home. There's going to be a bloodbath, and she left me. And I was doing a documentary last year on the fall of the Berlin Wall for Radio 4. And my fixer remained a sort of friend for quite many years. And she says, you know, I just feel I was such a coward. And forgive me, but I knew there was going to be blood. And I said, no, you know.
But then she probably wore one of these badges seriously.
But it's one of the, wasn't it one of the, I mean, let's throw it open to the floor, but wasn't it one of the most defining aspects of that, you know, what happened on November the 9th, that no one knew what the hell was going on. And we certainly didn't, the kind of worm's eye view of reporters. But nor did any of the politicians or statesmen. It caught everybody by surprise, I think. And no one, and it took them a while, you know, quite a while, I think, to you know, really to respond and react to what was. I mean, I don't think.
And when the Foreign Office discovered, they tried to stop it.
I don't think, exactly. I don't think Thatcher and the British Foreign Office had the faintest idea what was going on.
On the subject of the repression and just why, in none of the countries apart, I suppose, from Romania, was there a serious attempt to stop the revolution or to. I recently interviewed Imre Pojgoi, who I knew well at the time as the main reformist in the Hungarian Communist Party. And he related to me an incident I wasn't aware of at the time, back in April '89, when he discovered that Károly Gross, who was then the leader of the, had been for the previous year, the leader of the, what was left of the Hungarian Communist Party, and Pojgoi, as the main reformer in the party, Gross, effectively as a pragmatic but hard-line figure, had turned. Pojgoi discovered that his party comrade had been talking to the generals in Hungary, exploring the possibility what could be done if a political decision were made to try to stop it or to break the whole process. And Pojgoi went to Gross and said to him, you really ought to know your Hungarian history a little bit better, Mr. Gross, or Comrade Gross, I suppose he said to him, that when Hungarian soldiers are asked to fire on the crowd in Hungarian history, they do one of two things. Either they shoot their own officers, or they run home to their mothers. And do you really want to, you know, to put that possibility to them, to make them choose between the two? And it was good. Excellent comment.
Right, let's have some contributions, questions. Yeah.
Do you think that the Eastern Bloc could have existed without a barrier? Interesting question.
No.
Do you think that the Eastern Bloc could have existed without a barrier?
Should we take sort of 2 or 3 and then we can sort of get through a few people? I feel like David Dimbleby. Yes, the gentleman at the back of me.
Blue shirt.
No, not you, sir. The lady next to you. Any? Well, let's deal with that one first. Yeah.
I don't think so, because first of all, in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, it had been imposed. It wasn't a homegrown phenomenon. And I do remember, you know, the Soviets had this whole thing that, you know, they were the big brother, unfortunately, in this family. And the little brothers have greeted them with open arms. And I think it was the first superpower summit after Gorbachev came to power. And there were a bunch of Baltic people who were distributing among the press little, you know, posters that, you know, we never joined this thing voluntarily, because, you know, this sort of fake referendum. And a lot of my colleagues were saying, oh, you're not taking any notice of that. Because we were also supposed to be so in love with Gorbachev and therefore the Soviet Union that anything that reminded anybody that it wasn't a voluntary family, it was a forced marriage, it was not really, you know, but I kept in touch with these people. But unless you had the glue of fear, the entire system would fall apart. And I remember there was a friend of mine in Russia who was a psychiatrist, which was unfortunate in the Soviet Union, because he had to testify that various dissidents were insane and put them into mental hospitals, and then he objected, and so he lost his job and everything like that. And he was talking about his grandmother, because they were all stuffed in these horrible doms, you know, these sort of, you know, things that make, you know, 60s egg boxes look luxurious. And whenever Gorbachev came onto television, his children and the grandmother, you know, the children were, you know, bored and playing around, and she would say, don't, because somebody will know we're not watching. She was totally fixated on the Stalinist thing. And once you then said, no, it's okay. You can, you know, talk when Gorbachev is talking. My God, when he talked, as you know, it went on for, and 42ndly, for ages. That it didn't mean you went to the Gulag. And once you then removed the glue of fear, the whole thing fell apart. So in a way, once you remove the glue of fear, in Eastern Europe particularly, as we know it was a forced marriage, it couldn't, you know, it couldn't survive any longer without the glue of fear. And Gorbachev, although that was not his intention, he removed the glue of fear. He wanted to, I mean, you know, he was reared as a Stalinist, but he wanted to have, you know, socialism with a human face. But he didn't realize, I think at the time, that with glasnost and perestroika, he removed the glue. And of course it was inevitable.
But, yeah,
but
just to come in, I mean,
time,
simply to say, I mean, it wasn't just the glue of fear. I mean, the Eastern Bloc wasn't the Eastern Bloc; it was the Russian Empire.
Of course.
It was where it was how far they got in 1945.
Yeah.
And the slight exception to that was Romania, of course.
Yeah.
Which wasn't. Were two exceptions. Yugoslavia, which of course they wanted to be in it, but then Tito had sort of completely constructed another thing, and then Romania, which paid lip service to being part of the bloc, but actually was substantially more unpleasant than most bits of the Soviet Union. But all you had was the empire, and that was it. And that was the border was there. In 1949, the airlift was an attempt to swallow that up. The only real chance that there might have been for anything different happening was when Russia actually seriously did offer the possibility of all of Germany being united, but they wanted it to be agrarian, socialist, neutral. Yeah. And the West had the part to play. The West said, no, because we don't trust that, because we think that you're going to swallow that up too. Yeah. And so in the end you had an agreement to disagree, which is what first of all East Germany was, and what actually the wonderful four-power agreement on Berlin is, because the four-power agreement on Berlin doesn't even mention Berlin. Yes. It talks about the sectors, and the sectors approaching and encroaching on the sectors that aren't according to the sectors, and they couldn't even agree what they were talking about. And what Gorbachev did was simply sort of say that, well, no, I don't want us to go that far. He had no intention of realizing, and he wasn't just a Stalinist. Gorbachev was more than anything. He was a child of Khrushchev, because Gorbachev, you know, lived through the Khrushchev speech, and he'd grown up as a communist for sure, but a communist who suddenly was in the party when that great speech came out and said, actually, we've all been living a lie for the past 20 years.
Well, when he was at high school and sort of about to go to university, and he wrote this amazing essay singing the praises of Stalin, you know, the light of youth and all that.
But that was prior to 1956.
Yes, exactly. So he'd been brought up in that atmosphere. And, you know, I mean, I feel very sorry for him, because the law of unintended consequences, he realized that, you know, as he said in that famous walk in the woods with Shevardnadze, because when he looked at the economy, he realized that the Americans were going, you know, there was no point in going on like this. And he said to Shevardnadze, who was his, what was Shevardnadze then? Foreign. Who was a Georgian, and who rather disastrously went and ran a free, quote-unquote, Georgia. So we can't go on like this. And he realized he couldn't go on like this. And he thought, well, we can get the dynamism into the society that the Americans clearly have by freeing it up a bit. And it was the law of unintended consequences. What I feel so sad about is, first of all, the wall. When you go to Berlin now, there's very little of it left. Chunks of the wall are adorning a casino in Las Vegas, which, you know, in a way you can see some symbolism there, and a Microsoft headquarters.
See some symbolism there?
Yes, exactly. And the other thing is, you see Gorbachev advertising Pizza Hut and Louis Vuitton rubbish. And you know that ad, which they have? There he is sitting in a limo with his Louis Vuittons beside him, and it's passing the wall. But of course, you know perfectly well that was a setup. They just did a piece of concrete and painted graffiti on it. And I thought, You know, that's a kind of humiliating end to somebody who did actually, even if he didn't intend to, change the world.
There are some bits of the wall residing in my house as well. I don't know if that's symbolic or not, but actually I understand what you're saying about the glue of fear, because I had a very similar experience in Romania in December '89, where we were in Transylvania and we found the only English speaker, or the only fluent English speaker, who was a local teacher at the school, and sort of hired her to be our interpreter. And she was really afraid at first, but she kept giggling, and I said, "What's so funny?" And it was just that she was able to speak to you, without getting arrested, which was an extraordinary state of mind.
Go on. No, it was only on that. I remember an American photographer in Romania during the revolution saying to me, and I can't even remember who he was, but he said to me one evening that he'd never been in a country anywhere in the world where people didn't look into his lens, that it's the nature of photography that people, however awful what is happening to them, look into the lens and quite often smile. But in Romania, people looked away.
Sure.
And that was the most powerful illustration. Of that.
Definitely. I mean, to come in on that, a couple of years before this all happened, I went into Romania, and Romania was very nasty. There was nothing quite as nasty as Ceausescu's Romania, and they did not let journalists in at all at that stage. And having done the same trick, having been thrown out of East Germany and got back, it was also because I had two passports, because I was born in Northern Ireland, and therefore not only just two passports but two nationalities. I had British and Irish, so I was chucked out of one and came back in the other. But I went into Romania in 86, 87 on my Irish passport, on the days when you still had to state your nationality and your occupation on your passport. And I put as translator, and went in through elderly Siebenburg and Transylvania. It has three names for the three nationalities of the people who live there, and met what was just outside Sighișoara, the supposedly home of Dracula, Prince Vlad Dracul, German families, because all those Dracula films, you see the guys with the pitchforks, they were all Germans, because the Germans they called them Saxons there, but they were the peasants that were brought in the 15th century to help defend Wallachia against the Turks. And they had these what they called Wehrkirchen, which were churches with a wall built around them, and they were defensive churches. The idea being when the Turks came in, you would gather everybody inside them. But these German communities, German-speaking communities, were actually a very, very important part of the Romanian agricultural system. They were the bit that worked. And I went in to see some of these German families, and they, actually a pastor and his wife, and they lived under absolute dread of the Securitate all the time. And of course, one of the sad things about post-1989, as I'm sure Nick knows from the whole sort of Hungarian thing, is that that community has now completely vanished. They've all gone because they could go to Germany. And they've all just, that whole 500 years of history, for right or wrong, has just been wiped out, and those houses are now sort of lying empty or occupied by gypsies, or in better case, some of the Hungarians.
Let's get some other voices.
Sorry, we're too chatty.
No, it's okay. Lady at the back.
I have a friend who, at the time when the wall went down, was 15 years old, East German, and just asking him in the last week how he's feeling about and his memories of it. As in, how does he feel today, 20 years on? And he said something really, which kind of struck me. He said he spent the last 20 years trying to catch up culturally or in any other ways with some of the Western, of his generation, the Western people. So things like cultural references that I can relate to, like, the punk era and the romantic era in terms of music. It's something that he's still trying to struggle to, trying to want to catch up with. So I'm interested to know with some of the East German people here, if perhaps what their feelings and emotions are.
Could I just add to that? I would love to hear from some of the people here who actually are from East Germany, because there was that big wave of nostalgia in the 90s. With films like Sonnenallee and Goodbye Lenin, and then it's been taken over by things like Lives of Others. And there is still a certain amount of bittersweet. Is it what it was? Please, somebody tell us.
Can we? Well, some hands went up earlier. You did, and there were two ladies there, I think, as well. Come on, I'm going to volunteer you to speak. So, do you want to say something? There's a microphone coming.
Well, first of all, a small anecdote just to show what a big thing it was even to go to the wall on that night. I'm actually from the provinces, so I lived in Berlin at the time, but I'm not originally from there. So I was just walking around. When I went to Berlin, I just was just walking around. I just enjoyed it so much. And that was still, the wall was still closed. And one day, it was in the summer, I didn't even have a bag on me, I didn't have my ID card on me and anything. I just walked a little bit too close to the wall without any, intention of anything. But just crossing the first line of defense, which was just a line of signs. You are now getting too close to the wall, please turn back. And not having even a bag on me or a jacket or anything, I was then picked up by 2 border guards and taken to a cell and questioned. And because I didn't have an ID card on me, I was then kept in a cell until the people in my student hostel were able to come and pick me up and give proof of my identity. So that's just a short, sort of what it was like.
But young people like you, in the first wave that were coming to the wall, they were young people, and they all said to me, we just want to go for 20 minutes
have a look.
to see what it's like.
Yeah.
They didn't expect, or indeed think about unification. It was just, let's go and look. And, what I did like about, awful to say that, but oppressed people have political jokes, which is, I think, somebody who did a compilation of political jokes in, totalitarian, authoritarian regimes called Tiny Explosions of Rebellion. And East Germany was full of them. And the Trabi, as we all know, just a hopeless little car. And one of the jokes I heard before the wall came down was, how do you double the price of your Trabi? Put a banana in the back. The other banana joke, because they couldn't get bananas, was, how do we know that the East Germans are not descended from monkeys? How could East Germans, if they were monkeys, survive 28 years without a banana? And when I went into the Kudam, there were people handing out bananas to the Aussies. And it was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, because bananas for us, but banana jokes were quite frequent.
Did you, you put your hand up earlier, there's a microphone coming, but do you just talk to that lady at the back about, did you feel you had to catch up with... No, I'm sure you didn't. No.
I think there may be different layers depending on where one lived and what the upbringing was. Like, the 2 of us lived geographically not far away from each other.
In Berlin, or?
No, just outside of Berlin. And we had an entirely different upbringing. I had a father working for the armed forces. So my upbringing was slightly more conform with the system, not because my parents necessarily believed in it, just out of protection. Whereas she had a more free upbringing with being allowed to watch West German television and having watched Sesame Street and all that, which I didn't. So in that respect, I have a cultural gap. But I always had that gap in comparison to other children who grew up beside me who were allowed to do all that at home. So it's more, I think it's a very individual thing to have.
So for people with access to West German TV, they, we know that they knew what was going on, but there wasn't any kind of cultural sense of, well, they've got that there, but, where's our punk or alternative comedy or
I think we had some
new
sort
romantics
of punk.
or whatever.
I think you had equivalents.
It wasn't very good though, was it?
You had to find you had to find the niches, and obviously there was a censorship.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of bands, not necessarily punk, who would not be allowed to publish their albums because they refused to submit to censorship, and they would just go around the little places and play in little clubs. But you knew the songs just by singing it to each other. And then, once the wall came down, you had the songs on the radios.
Yeah.
In fact, a friend of mine in East Berlin, a guy called Manner Schulz. Manner had actually been a very good, ordinary Prenzlauer Berg working class family, and they were living in Prenzlauer Berg in '61. But his dad, who was a painter and decorator, had just got a job about 800 yards away in Wedding. But Manner was staying with his granny because it was the school holidays, and they built the wall. And so he didn't see his parents for another 5 years when his West Berliners were next allowed to come over. But actually, by the time we got there, Manor had believed he was a beast, he was a huge bloke, and he worked as a road mender. And he'd had appendix surgery, but he was so fat that it had all gone horribly wrong. And Manor, as a result of this, was then in his mid-30s, but he became a Frührentner. He was allowed, but he was on an invalidity benefit. And invalids, like pensioners, were allowed to cross because the communist state basically hoped if you stay over there, we don't have to give you any money, so that's cool. But Manor, of course, came back. Because Manic went over there and saw his mum and his dad and his brothers, who were all the same size, on a huge diet of cream cakes and coffee every afternoon. You know, they really gone for the thing. But Manor, his brother, would give him tapes. He would tape West German pop music. And he would do that, and he would buy porn. He would buy porno mags in West Berlin, and he would shove these down his underpants. And it would be a very, very brave border guard who wanted to investigate Manner's underpants. So Manner came back over the border at Friedrichstraße, because he came through, and from being this big, fat, basically friendless bloke, he became a DJ rock star. Because at 37, with the money that he brought back, he bought in East Germany, he bought quite decent, East Germany, you'll remember, quite decent basic sound quality stuff. And he bought a turntable, and he bought a cassette player, and he dealt porno, and he dealt all this stuff. And actually, when the wall came down, he was devastated. Ruined his life.
Can I just add something? I was 18 when the wall came down, so I have a fair memory. I just would like to say I had a nice childhood.
Sorry,
Nice childhood.
I'm fed up with people saying it was you poor East Germans. No, I had a nice time. Sorry, it was good. I wasn't allowed to watch Dallas. I had to go to bed at 11. Yeah. So, no, but it was...
So you're making an important point, though, and that is that you didn't feel growing up in East Germany that you were missing out on anything.
No, you were protected, of course. You couldn't say what you wanted to say. I did sometimes. Wasn't so good, but can you say now what you want to say?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I wrote recently was about the wall in the head, as you know. I mean, the remarkable numbers of people, you go to Berlin, who always lived in the East, they don't go to the West now. And it's still a foreign country in the sense of the wall in the head. And a woman called Mariana Bertler, who I met when she was organizing or helped organize the demonstrations from the Gethsemane Church. And she said to me then, I don't want unification, I just want to have a more humane society. She's now in charge of the Stasi files. And she's very bitter because she's an East German and she's not paid as much as the equivalent. And there is that resentment on both sides because the Aussies feel that they're treated as, lazy, buggers who are used to living on welfare. And, the whole thing, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And then suddenly, they're denounced by the West. And also, of course, the reunification has cost the West an enormous amount of money. And the West regards them as lazy, welfare-dependent, whinging people. And there is still that wall in the head. Yeah, now, it doesn't...
Even now, 20 years on.
Absolutely. It doesn't terribly apply to young people. But the older people who find,
She's young and she's nodding. No, she's agreeing.
It applies to me. It's in my head.
Yes,
I think
it's the wall in the head.
My age.
And it's going to take a long time for the wall in the head to come down.
It will never go away because it's still there. After 20 years, you still get paid less.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wish I'd had, you two at least here. I've just come back from Berlin yesterday. And I was doing a seminar there, and I was almost shouted down by people sort of saying, everything in East Germany was horrible and repressive. Okay, you had travel restrictions, all this. There were a lot of things you couldn't do. You had to know who you could trust before you could say things. But actually, everyday life wasn't awful. People had good friends, and if you had a nice bar, and I'm guessing you were maybe in the FDJ. Now, the FDJ, no? Oh, good.
But I think under
you know, I mean, people, they were drafted into that, but I was trying to explain this to people, saying the FDJ may have been a party organisation, but actually it was quite cool about sex on camping trips, and it was quite cool about drinking beer. I mean, and therefore, actually, for most teenagers, it wasn't awful.
And there was a security of employment, which, of course, there wasn't after unification. And the East Germans still tend to describe the West Germans as the elbow society. You elbow everybody out who is not quite of your, you know, your thinking. And work-life balance, they think doesn't exist in the West.
A few hands going up, but you've got the microphone, so...
Yeah, it's me again, sorry. I think we sort of share the first... Sorry, what's the name? Okay, we sort of share the little bit conformist upbringing. My mom was a teacher, so as a teacher she was a party member. We were not really allowed to watch West German TV. We still did. My family members from the West weren't really allowed to visit us at home, but we saw them at my grandmother's. Basically, I'm not particularly thinking that I'm particularly unhappy with my childhood. I mean, my mom was working hard, but she paid like 70 Eastmarks rent for our flat. Basics were cheap, luxuries were either expensive or unattainable. But I wasn't bullied for not wearing fashionable clothes, because there were only 2 kids in my school class who were getting Western fashion. So they were like standing out. Yeah. But so there was a sense of, the materialistic thing was just not happening. There was a sense of, let's all think of something else than money.
And
you know,
just to say that, but I just last night I was in a bar in Prenzlauer Berg on Samstagabend, and Sylvia, it's the same bar.
Sylvia, who's in a bar, were you? Huh? You weren't in a bar, sure.
I was in a bar, so it's the same, of course. That's how you get to know people. And Sylvia, who's now Die Wirtin, the landlady from Metzeg, we were discussing rent. And she's lived in the same, she still lives in the same flat above the pub that she did all these years. And she was saying that she's, that if she'd been looking for a new rent, they'd be after €1,000 a month, and that's a lot of money. And she's just debated, and she's happy she's signed a 12-year agreement at 340. But she's still renting, you know, she's a landlady of a pub, and she's still renting, and she's happy she needs the rent to be kept low so she can still live. And she doesn't think it's necessarily, she wouldn't turn back time, but it's not necessarily so much better.
No, one of my friends had a house which, insofar as you owned anything in East Germany, but you know, it was accepted that she owned it. But unfortunately, with reunification, it was land that had been expropriated from a West German family, and they came back. And I used to get anguished emails from her, because they were thinking of selling it, or putting up the rent to something that they considered to be a commercial rent. In the end, she did a deal with them, but it was extremely unnerving. And I think the loss of a kind of security, however dull, is very traumatizing. And I think sometimes West Germans I talk to are just so impatient. They say, for heaven's sake, that's why it was a hopeless place. And the funny thing is that, of course, in the Soviet bloc, East Germany was considered to be the glamorous, almost capitalist place, you know.
You didn't suffer the shortages, or, you know, for example, they did in Poland, of meat, of, you know, basics like toilet paper. You know, when the toilet paper arrived, there'd be a queue, you know. And should we take some more? There's a few hands at the back. A gentleman there, and then perhaps we go over there next.
Just a brief point, because this, I think, is segged into an interesting article I read last Thursday in the Baltic Times, where they produced a survey about 3 weeks ago of opinion in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in respect of capitalism and the free market. And I can't remember the exact figures, but in all 3 countries, support for, and I presume these are resident Baltic states people rather than people that are expats, it was less than 50% in all 3 of the countries. And when you looked at the over 60s age group, support for capitalism, the free market, was down to 25%. And I think this reflects all the issues. I've been working there for on and off since 1992, so I've seen the big changes. I can see the disillusionment. I went there on accession night in 2004, the 1st of May, expecting a party like the Berlin Wall. I stood in the Old Town Square in Vilnius, not one car horn honked. There wasn't one firework. Compare that to last year when they became capital of culture, and there was a €2 million firework display. My point is that I think that things do change. The danger is that I think we can have a rosy view of the past, whether that be from a capitalist or from a socialist perspective. But as things get tighter, yeah, the point that I made about the basics that society gave you in the East, I think, you know, they gave a security. Capitalism is a mindset. There is a wall. It's not just a Berlin Wall up there. There's also a wall in people's mind about the free market. And the adaptation has been very, very difficult. Although, and this poll is just very, very sobering to think that, you know, I'd heard this in Czechoslovakia 20 years ago, or the early, 18, 15 years ago. But to hear that these sort of figures are now, it's quite worrying in some ways.
And there's a guy here with the glasses and the green top. Stand up.
So does that mean that Oscar Lafontaine and possibly even Mrs. Thatcher were right and that German unification should not have gone ahead? I mean, do East Germans feel that their country was in effect hijacked by Bundeskanzler Kohl?
I'm going to bring Nick in because I mean this is the subject of at least half of your book. You know, what's happened since and how it's all shaped up, good or bad.
I wouldn't say there's a nostalgia for what went before. It's important to sort of break down the figures. The unpopularity of communism today, which is very true. There was the Pew Global Attitude Survey a few weeks ago, which, for example, coming back to Hungary, it showed that the Hungarians were most dissatisfied. I think there was a 77% in Hungary. 77% of people asked said they were dissatisfied with capitalism. But in the same survey, the Hungarians showed the most interest. They cared most about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. So the figures here, so that there is if there's a nostalgia, especially among older people, I think it's a nostalgia for going to the cinema once a week, going out to a restaurant once a week. On the day Hungary joined the European Union, on the BBC Evening Television News, on the news at 9, I think it was, still 9 o'clock news, we did a split screen with a Spanish bus driver and a Hungarian bus driver, and there were simple questions to each of them. We profiled each. How many times do you go to the cinema? When did you last take your wife out for
you going to say something else?
To eat? Yeah. And so there's that. Yeah. But in terms of the walls in people's minds, I devote, out of the 15 chapters in my book, a whole chapter to maternity care in Eastern Europe today, and especially in Hungary and in Poland. And there, there's a sense of the doctors. I described the doctors, the obstetricians and gynecologists in Hungary today as a Politburo, as a central committee, unwilling to let go of maternity care. They, under Hungarian law and under in most East European countries, obviously not in, I would imagine in East Germany, but a doctor still has to be present at every birth. The profession of midwifery is still completely suppressed. Women are not encouraged to choose the position in which they give birth, to influence their own medical care. And I think that's true across medical care in general. It's very corrupt, even though in theory it's free still in some countries. And there's this sense of authoritarian attitudes. Perhaps some of those authoritarian attitudes predated communism. Perhaps some of those were Prussian attitudes going back a long time. But a sense of and I think, just to sort of broaden that out from healthcare, there are lobbies in Eastern Europe, powerful lobbies. It's not, these are not really advanced democracies in which people really feel that the promise of 1989, the empowerment which they felt back in '89, has been really fulfilled. It's more a jungle democracy or an anarchic democracy in which the most powerful lobbies get to control the society. And that's why I think this Pew Global Attitudes study is so interesting, because it shows how people feel that they, in a way, they won back power in '89 and they've lost some of it.
What's the answer to gentleman's question? Were Oscar Lafontaine and Margaret Thatcher right to...
The answer is no.
No.
They're purely and simply no. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was actually sort of going from a Chamberlain, Churchillian sort of British 1939 point of view. She just didn't want to see change because she was comfortable with the old world order. La Fontaine, of course, actually would have preferred to see East Germany take over West Germany.
No, she certainly didn't want unification. I interviewed her. She was the most maddening interviewee ever, apart from Imelda Marcos. The pair of them were just as bad. Because they talked about, they didn't ask questions. They went into great sort of streams, and I wanted to talk to her about the prospect of unification. And she knows that it's only an hour, so she keeps talking, and she got into talking about Toronto's rubbish collection.
She once famously, in one of her first interviews with, I think it was with Robin Day, before she became Prime Minister, when she was Conservative Party leader, walked into an interview and said, right, there are my answers. Now, what are your questions?
Yes. But I kept saying, you know, please, I'm asking you about your attitude to possible reunification. And then she said, no, no, people forget history. She was obsessed with the idea that Germany, once reunited, there would be Prussian militarism again. It was shared by Mitterrand, if you remember, who was president of France at the time. He said, I love Germany so much, I'd like to have two of them. But she would have been astonished to discover that, in fact, instead of becoming Prussianly militaristic and imperialist, they turned out to be the most pacifist nation in Europe. That would not have fitted her mind thing. It wasn't change she was against. My God, she changed us. It was more that she lived with the old attitudes towards Germany, that it could never be other than Prussianly militaristic, and she was wrong.
Yep.
Going back to the discussion about feelings on both sides, I lived in East Berlin, sadly, before reunification, in the early 80s, in the British Embassy there. And every time we could cross over very easily with a little pass through any one of the, or many of the crossings, but we had to undergo a sort of schizophrenia daily, going from one sort of civilization to another. I'm sure Peter had the same experience. And I would be on, my flat was on the Leipziger Strasse, opposite a place that sold exotic foods, and there would be, first thing on a Saturday morning, a queue would start at around about 7 o'clock, and it would stretch for 20, 30 meters down the road by the time I was having breakfast. Whereas the only queue I ever saw in West Berlin going across was a sale they had in a fur shop for...
But it was much more physical, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, advertising billboards.
That's right.
And, you know, and all the other things, the cars and the number of cars and quality
of course,
cars and all that
going
stuff.
into KaDeWe on the food hall upstairs was just mind-blowing for anybody who had lived in the East.
Actually, anybody British in those days.
Yes,
sounds like better than anything here.
It still is, I think. But the thing I miss most, I think, and I discovered when I was in East Germany that I had family over there. My mother was German, and like most Germans, they have people all over the place, and I got to know them quite well. But I also got to know a lot of East Germans, distant types and all the rest of it. But the depth of friendship you had with those people was something you couldn't replicate over here. It's still moving to think about it.
Yeah.
And is that because you were sort of special? And was that a kind of brotherhood in adversity, kind of? Was that
Very much.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the Blitz thing in London, on the whole, in adversity, the Brits came together. But now, of course, not particularly. And I think that was it, partly.
Well, it was terrible leaving because I knew that I wasn't allowed by my own security people to be in touch with them. I had to explain that I was a Geheimnisträger, which meant that I carried secrets. And they immediately understood that because their Geheimnisträger weren't supposed to speak to me. You see, so when I said that I was a Geheimnisträger, then I cut off. But then the great thing was to ring on the 9th, exactly 20 years ago today. One of the guys, and tell him, you better go to the war, you know, the Bornholmstrasse. And he didn't know. He had gone to bed. And he went off, and he wrote me the most beautiful letter afterwards explaining what had happened, but I won't bore you with all that now.
No, it wouldn't bore us.
Because it's replicated around here so many times, but it was an extremely moving experience for him, too, to go across.
Absolutely. And Cardiff, of course, it completely blew their minds.
He didn't have the West money, as Peter was mentioning.
But there were people on...
taxi drivers were just giving them free lifts.
Yeah, and at the Kempinski in the West, there's some rather very sort of, you know, stereotypical West German boss type was coming in and solemnly handing out 100 Deutschmarks to people. So that, and I said, and he was very embarrassed because this was showing a kind of emotion which she didn't really approve of. I said, why are you doing that? He said, I know they're all going to go back, but I want them to have a nice time when they were here. Well, they didn't all go back.
I just wanted to say that actually reading Nick's book, what really struck me was that the danger is tonight that we're all being too self-congratulatory. We said numerous times there was no Tiananmen Square, but what Nick brings out so brilliantly in his book is that in fact the whole thing started off a game of consequences which ended in more than a Tiananmen Square, it ended in a genocide in Bosnia, and I just think that it might be interesting to hear a few words from Nick about that.
The sense of 1989 as a patriotic revolution, I think, was sometimes underestimated at the time. What I've always been, as a former demonstrator myself before I became a journalist, as a former environmental activist, I've always been very interested in what brings people out onto the streets, what motivates them to leave the comfort of their own kitchens or living rooms. And in '89, through the region, the national pride of the Hungarians, of the Czechs, of the Germans, to actually express themselves, to shake off the shackles of a kind of false internationalism, however strong the sense of humanism was as well at that time, was very strong. And to bring that through to Bosnia and what happened in the early 1990s, the breakup of Yugoslavia, I felt that if the patriotic element in '89 had been better appreciated by Helmut Kohl, by Margaret Thatcher, by American leaders, by other West European leaders, the patriotic emotions in Serbia, in Croatia, in Kosovo, in Bosnia could have been handled much better. I quote a Croatian friend saying to me in 1991 that what we would really like to do in Yugoslavia is import Europe into Yugoslavia, but if you don't let us, we're going to export Yugoslavia into Europe, which is, of course, what happened with the refugees, with the if one just counts the number of peacekeeping forces, the UN personnel who've died there, the people from the agencies, the journalists who were killed there as well. Yugoslavia was exported, and but it could so easily have been handled. You know, we saw how in East Germany, how the sacrifice of West Germans, how Germans were really willing from the West to make some economic sacrifices as well to reintegrate Eastern Europe. And had Western Europe been willing or given the opportunity by its so-called statesmen to reintegrate Europe, if it hadn't just been a question of Eastern Europe catching up with the standards and the economic practices of the West and being allowed in 14 years later, there would have been more enthusiasm on the streets of Vilnius or of Riga or of Budapest or of Prague in 2004, in Bucharest and Sofia in 2007. And I think the same mistake, there's a danger of the same mistake being made again today with the Western Balkans. The people of Serbia, of Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania today, I think, always felt they belonged to Europe. The geographical center, according to Ukrainians, of Europe, taken from the Atlantic to the Urals, is, of course, outside the town of Uzhgorod. And there's a big plaque, a big concrete pillar outside Uzhgorod, which is in western Transcarpathian Ukraine, saying this is the center of Europe. I think more more willingness, more enthusiasm, more
well, you know, that
idea of Europe.
The thing is that, you know, one of the faults of these totalitarian systems is, of course, to decide that nationalism is ipso facto a crime. Crush it. The trouble is, it is such an ancient, ancient instinct. You cling to your own. Now, the thing about Bosnia, I worked in Bosnia, I worked in, during that business, and in Serbia and Croatia, because Yugoslavia was an artifact, and Tito, who was actually a Croat, he made it absolutely forbidden to talk about your, you know, origins. And the great sort of thing about Jasenovac, which is this terrible concentration camp where, you know, Croats murdered Serbs and all the rest of it. And there was a Muslim SS regiment there. And
was that the Stasi?
No, that was. But the problem was that you were not allowed to say, I'm a Croat, I'm a Serb. People don't forget where they came from. And if you put a lid on something so firmly, it doesn't go away. As soon as the lid is lifted slightly, then all those ancient, you know, furies and grievances explode. And that's what happened in Bosnia. And you know, the Serbs are absolutely obsessed with 1389, which you may, of course, all remember was the famous battle which they lost against the Ottomans, the field of blackbirds in Kosovo. And every Serb nationalist, whether they were Bosnian Serbs or Serbs, they would start with 1389. And they had never, under Yugoslavia, been allowed to remember 1389, but they remembered it. And of course, as soon as allowed to remember it, then it builds up into this head of genocidal steam.
I felt the situations were very different, because I covered Bosnia and Croatia and all that as well. And I just felt that, that, you know, Eastern Europe was under this kind of Soviet yoke, and it was about breaking out of that. And I had endless arguments. We had endless arguments at ITN about whether or not Yugoslavia was a civil war or not. I never accepted that it was.
No, I never accepted it was.
I never accepted it was.
It's just one part of the civil war
was
actually better.
Yeah,
I just thought that the Serbs were obviously better armed. They had more materiel. But, you know...
But, I mean, Serbia was Yugoslavia. I mean, Serbia was the dominant force. And I don't agree at all that totalitarian states don't like nationalism. I don't think either Hitler or Stalin would have said that. They think they use nationalism very strongly.
But certainly the communist states did.
But Yugoslavia was a completely separate case, because Yugoslavia was Tito's construct. It was held together because it wasn't east and it wasn't quite west. So it was held together, and as soon as you took away one side, it went poof and exploded. And it was one of those things in April of 1989, when we were all getting excited about things starting to move in Eastern Europe. I was in Kosovo, Polje. I mean, it's 1389, the Battle of the Field of Blackbirds. But, you know, Kos is Serbian for blackbird. So Kosovo means of the blackbirds. Polje is field. So, you know, again, when we talk about this, this is why when you ask an Albanian, they say Kosovo is ours. The Serbs say, well, it's not even got a name in your language. And they may be 90% of the population, but that explains why there's some of this, you know, huge feeling about it. And I was there when Milosevic came down in a helicopter, you know, and I had these visions of those pictures in 1938 of Hitler landing at Nuremberg, and here was Slobodan came down in a field, and he was there, and they were there chanting it. This is 10% of the population. Serbians bust in from all around the country. And I suddenly thought, hey, you know, if it all does go as nice as we hope it might in the rest of Europe, it's going to go absolutely tits up in Yugoslavia.
No, you're right. I misspoke, as I think the American spin doctors would say. That obviously nationalism, I feel, is an incredibly deep instinct. Putin, as you know, who now says, or he said as soon as he came to power, that the greatest catastrophe, geopolitical catastrophe in this century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. He's an old-fashioned Russian nationalist. Now, whenever any regime is in trouble, they turn to that ancient instinct of nationalism.
Last refuge of the scoundrel.
But you know, yeah, well, now I won't hear a word against Johnson.
Putin, of course, he was a KGB officer, wasn't he, in East Germany at the time.
My KGB fixer, who
you
eventually...
didn't know him, did you?
He knew him. You know, they were both based in Dresden. And he said, I can't believe it, Volodya, as he always called it, has become this great man. He's just such an entity, and he didn't drink, you know, which of course was not Russian of him. I mean, he drank a little, but
we're a long way from Tamala. Should we, are there some more contributions? Yes, thank you for that.
You touched base on the role of church in the 80s and on the dissidents. I would like maybe to listen a bit more of your experience with these people in East Germany. Who were the dissidents and the church, the role of the church.
The role of the church in your experience.
The role of the church, particularly in Poland, was fantastically important. And, you know, people say that when you think about, you know, what brought down communism was John Paul II. I doubt it, but still. Certainly, as we're talking about East Germany, the church in Leipzig, and the one I had dealings with in Berlin, the Gethsemane, that was the area where they could, you know, mount demonstrations, and because even the Stasi were afraid of them.
And they were demonstrating also at that time about the environment, which hasn't been mentioned tonight.
I wasn't at all surprised in Poland, because Poland's so Catholic, and there was
not so
Father Jerzy Popiełowski and other people, with, of course, you know, the Pope John Paul II, being a huge influence. But of course, because Poland is so Catholic, they never accepted communism, you know, so they always lived under
but they always used to say, you know, I'm a member of the party because it annoys the church, and I go to the strip club because it annoys the bishop. I mean, they were quite good at doing both ways.
Get completely drunk to annoy both,
Sorry?
You can get completely drunk to annoy both. But I personally was quite surprised that the churches in East Germany played such a central role.
No, the East German church, this is incredibly important, because this is, I mean, I'm talking going way back, 1981, 82. There was nothing... pockmarked, grubby old flat that we lived in, Hinterhof behind it, a backyard. The building behind it had been destroyed by bombs. Down in the basement lived a bloke called Volker, who looked a bit like Bjorn from ABBA, and he was a gravedigger, but he really wanted to be a hippie. And he was going out with this girl who was probably underage, who we only discovered later was actually the daughter of a senior Stasi guy. In fact, the guy who was so important was he was East Germany's closest thing to James Bond. I found out from my Stasi files in the 90s, he'd actually subverted a CIA agent in Africa. And anyway, so they were really concerned that I knew these people. I had no idea. I was just talking to Volker because, you know, he was a lad. And but what in those days, and I was 25, he was 22. So, you know, he said, you want to go and have a beer and talk about things. But he was vaguely, they watched all those protests in West Germany, because this is the time of the Pershing cruise missiles. And they watched them all and they thought, look at that, amazing, all these kids can go out there, you know, smoke weed and have long hair and go and know missiles. Why can't we do stuff like that? And in the Protestant church, the Lutheran church, which actually, you know, was fairly unimportant in East Germany, but they gave the kids, it's like youth clubs in England offering a place for kids to go when they can't go into pubs in the evening. The churches in East Germany said, yeah, you can come, you can hang out here. And they did something very, very, very important. They gave them this badge, Schwerter zu Pflugscharen. And it was, they adopted, it was wonderful, very, very clever. There's a Soviet monument outside the United Nations in New York, which is from a biblical motif, and it shows a man beating a plough, beating a sword and turning it into a plough. And it's from a quote, and my Bible's not good, but somewhere it says, they shall smite their ploughs, their swords into ploughshares. And they put these up, but most importantly, brilliantly, they did them as stick-on, sew-on badges for your jeans. And that was cool, because they sewed these things onto their jeans. And that became a movement, and that's how the Gethsemane Kirche and all those Protestant churches gradually got together. And you know, I've got this title in my book, Berlin Wall, My Part in Stand For, which is actually, of course, sounds very arrogant. It's partly because of Spike Milligan, of course, just saying I was a foot soldier in the trenches. But there is one tiny little incident that almost justifies it, which is that in 1982, Volker downstairs told me, hey, you know, it's the anniversary of the bombing of Frauenkirche in Dresden next week. He said, we're all saying, you know, we're for peace, like they are in West Germany. Why don't we all go down and have a demonstration for peace against missiles? I thought, that's interesting. You've got to do that. He says, yeah, we're going to do that. So I put out a little paragraph on, and it went out on Reuters. And the same evening, it came back as a little item on East German, West German news, ARD, and said, you know, sources in the East German peace movement say they will plan a demonstration. And so a few days later, I said, Folk, are you going down there? He said, where? I said, to Dresden, you know, the thingy. I said, yeah, I haven't got a car. I said, I'll give you a lift, come with me. We went down to Dresden, and sure enough, there are a couple of hundred kids starting to gather, outnumbered by gentlemen walking up and down, looking very quietly, uninterested, who were obviously plainclothes police and or Stasi. And they all gathered around the church, and after a while, these kids started going braver, and they started saying, give peace a chance. And a few of them had candles, and they lit them, and they stuck them in, because the Frauenkirche was a heap of rubble. And they all sort of stood there, and the police moved closer. And there was a sort of uneasy standoff. There were maybe 400 or 500 at most. So I started going around asking them, how did you hear about this? And every single one of them said, oh, it was on West German TV. Bollocks, you know. Because we had, I mean, it was different because I was working for a news agency, and we had a Star Trek, the Prime Directive. You know, you may boldly go whatever you want, but do not interfere. And I'd blown it.
Hence his title. Because I was doing a thing on, no, it wasn't CNN, something else about the wall. And I think Michael Meyer, who's also written a book, and he said, there was this small paragraph on Reuters, and I said, hang on, I know the man who wrote it. So it really was.
On the church, we can't let the subject go, the influence of the church, without mentioning Romania and Pastor Laszlo Tőkés, the Hungarian priest in Timișoara. And of course, really, it's hard to imagine, clearly there might have been a Romanian revolution without that. But the way it happened, a minority priest saying to his congregation on a Sunday that this coming Friday, I've been told I'm going to be evicted from my church. Please come, please do not use violence to prevent them taking me away from you, but please witness, like the early Christians, be there to witness me and my wife and child being expelled from our parish. And of course the crowd, a few hundred parishioners came, they stood outside Tőkés's house. This is still December the 15th, 1989. And then all the Romanians started joining them. And the congregation thought that these were agents provocateurs who want to give the Securitate an opportunity, an excuse to intervene and throw him out. But then it turned out that the Romanians actually had had enough. They had broken through Ceausescu's policy of opposing the minorities, opposing the Hungarians and assimilating them. And so the Romanians joined the Hungarians in the street. The crowd moved from several hundred to several thousand, and the a Romanian jumped up on the, as I related in my book, onto the roof of a tram stuck in all this crowd of anarchic people and shouted, my name is Mihai Zaganescu. I invite you, the crowd, to chant with me, long live Pastor Tőkés, down with Ceausescu, down with the dictatorship. And that was, in a sense, the moment where a small protest of a few Christians trying to protect their priest turned into a revolution.
And then he got taken away, do you remember? And then he got taken up to this, and eventually turned up in this village north of Zalał in...
Mină.
And I went there and found him. And,
when he was still captured there, held there.
And did an exclusive interview with him, and he was astonished by what had happened. You know, I mean, he had, you know, clearly...
He tried to persuade the crowd to go home. He was worried for his pregnant wife in the house. He was worried that there was going to be an incident that people would be hurt as a result of.
But even at that stage, some days later, he was, you know, he just, I mean, he just couldn't believe what was going on. And again, it was a sort of, it was, you know, it was ground up, wasn't it? Was it?
It was at the beginning. It was hijacked later.
It was different.
But I think it was a genuine revolution. At
the start. Because the shooting of the Ceausescus was a kind of communist plot, wasn't it? Coup.
Right. Any more? Do we have some more contributions? How are we doing for time? A few more minutes, I think, if people want to say more. Thank you.
I was curious.
There's a mic coming, so everyone can hear you. We don't repress free speech here.
If the Berlin Wall had fallen today, with the cacophony of news media that happens with twittering and everything like that, do you think it would have diluted the impact of the Berlin Wall coming down?
How do you mean diluted the impact?
just because there would be, I imagine there would just be so many...
physical walls are irrelevant these days.
Well, there'd be so many sources coming from all sides that, you know, a sense of...
I think it would have been exaggerated, totally, because I do a lot with Iran. And the Twitters and everything from Iran, I mean, there was a time when you wouldn't have heard anything from what was going on in Iran. But the malocracy, as I call them, now can't control it. I mean, when I was in Iran about 2 years ago, you know, the whole thing of the internet cafe, well, that had become very popular, partly because chaps and girls used to go to the internet cafe because they weren't segregated. But every time the regime tries to close them down, they spring up, you know, round the corner again. Now, that has made a huge difference to the Western idea of what's going on in Iran. And I think, actually, if you'd had the internet then, it would have been faster. You know, I don't think it would be different except in terms of timeline.
But, you know, Ahmadinejad is still president, and the regime is still very oppressive, and
yeah, but you know, the thing is that they have now lost the mandate of heaven, as you know, and it's just a question of time. It's always the problem with timelines. I originally mistook what the timeline for the collapse of the Eastern Bloc would be, and that's why I was rather casual. I'll fit it in, you know. It's sort of,
there was a Bush telegraph then, which we would call the internet today,
yes.
but it was a Bush telegraph of people
yes.
phoning each other, telling each other. The students from Prague, when they knew that their own demonstrations and police actions against them wouldn't be broadcast by the media, they set out across Czechoslovakia and held meetings in factories, and stood up in the middle of towns, and they printed at the Faculty of Arts tens of thousands of black and white photographs just to tell people what was going on around the country.
It didn't become global. Now, you know, I mean, every morning I get up, I look at my inbox, and the emails from Iran are just non-stop. I mean, it's quite exhausting if you happen to think, you know, I need to go and do some shopping. And, but, you know, now the world knows what's going on in Iran. Of course, because it's unmediated, as we always complain about Twitters and all that. There's nobody sort of, well, mediating it to see if it's right. But, I mean, I think it has made a huge difference to all these nations where, you know, ground up is they can get their views out to the outside world. Same applies in China. I mean, Iran now has the most active blogging community in the world, which is incredible.
I'm sorry, I'm going to disagree with all of this, actually. No, don't forget, the internet's physical. We all have come to accept it as being there. But actually, it doesn't exist completely in China. There is the Great Firewall, and it certainly doesn't exist in North Korea. Tell me anybody who's got any good blogs from North Korea recently. And it doesn't exist even in this country, where Peter Mandelson doesn't understand it, wants to clamp down on file sharing. And anyone who tried to access YouTube videos, and a few months ago, before it was changed, found that Britain was excluded from them. And if you look now that there's a number of American newspapers thinking of closing access to their websites from the UK because of Britain's libel laws, all you have to do is take down the masts. You can turn it off. It's still physical.
I think you're not as sophisticated as some of the bloggers. Iran has...
Take down the masts.
No,
internet
it doesn't make any
phone
difference.
Line or a cable.
Make any difference. I thought that too.
How do you get out without a cable or a phone line?
Oh, I can tell you. You can get... I mean, the mobile phone, for example, the reason we know...
No good without a mast.
What?
It's no good without a mobile phone mast.
Do you know... I was trying to get into North Korea, and because there was no, and I'd obviously been refused, so I went up to the border, which is on the Tumen River in northeast China, where I was told you couldn't get a mobile signal at all. One of the things about these societies they make mistakes about was I was sitting there because I was seeing, you know, people fleeing from the famine. Refugees were hiding in kimchi pits, poor darlings. And I just switched off on my mobile. There was no way that I was supposed to be able to get through to Britain. But because it's so militarized, it was jumping on all sorts of masts. Now, the military have the masks. Now, if you have particularly sophisticated things, and you get things out of North Korea, I do, through mobiles, through, you know, people who cross the Tumen River. I mean, believe you me, I mean, I know what you mean. You keep thinking this is not possible. North Korea, why do we ever see executions from North Korea? Because there is a kind of mobile phone thing. There's what they call the underground railway. They can get the stuff out. I think it's become more and more difficult for these societies. They can put up firewalls, of course, and they can take down masks and they close ISPs. But in the end, they will lose.
I think it is more and more difficult, but believe me, give me control of this country's telecommunications tomorrow, and I can cut off Great Britain from the internet.
No.
Cut it off, really.
Good
a few
luck,
bulldozers
Peter.
and a full...
No way could you
very
succeed. No way.
You still managed to get information and pictures from out of Burma.
Sorry?
The Burmese uprising. We still managed to get information and pictures out of Burma.
Indeed.
That,
this
you know,
is what I
there was
mean.
no-
Every government thinks that we can block things all the time. Falun Gong, you know, which is this, what the Chinese called cult, it not only sends stuff back from China, it also managed to disrupt the Chinese system because they managed to break into Chinese news television with their propaganda. Huge drama, of course, because they're totally banned, and they are very clever, and they managed to do it. And as you say, Burma, why do we ever get anything out of Burma? Because people are able, there are underground railways, as they call them. There are very sophisticated people who are working outside, going inside, or contacting people. We know more about Burma than we did 20 years ago. We know more about what's going on in China than we did. We know more about North Korea. And again, I'm slightly on the North Korean diaspora network too. And it's amazing what you can get out. So you see, you still live in the pen and pencil age.
yeah, right. Yeah, okay, sure. I think it's you'd find out if you really tried, you would be. It is certainly far more difficult. But do not think that we're secure in our freedom of information. Do not ever think that we're secure in anything. You know, we live in this country with more surveillance cameras than anywhere else. Do not think also that we are more free than certain elements of Eastern Europe were.
Okay, that feels like another question. I mean, you know,
I'm
I just wonder.
So I agree with you on the surveillance
I just wonder if we had Twitter and all the rest of it, if we'd had it 20 years ago, whether it might have just happened much quicker because word would spread much quicker.
I'd just like to make a comment on that, actually.
Even more people. Please do. Yeah.
First of all, I think personally that the importance of the internet is slightly overstated for two reasons. We've had blogs and the internet and Twitter for quite a while now, and they haven't actually brought down any suppressive regimes. Yet one can
No,
hope,
it's
of
timeline,
course.
always.
So that may happen, but it certainly hasn't happened yet. And the second thing is that people assume that the internet is far more anonymous than it actually is. So there is, of course, the thing of shutting down the internet, which is possible to a certain extent. But there is also the fact that if you post something on Twitter, say on an oppressive regime, say Iran, the government could find out who you are. And this actually did happen in the disputed elections recently. Yeah. And a lot of the people that actually ended up in jail or worse were people that posted up on Twitter. And the regime is not down, and a lot of people have been tortured. So I think that this is slightly overstated.
No, I just think that there are very brave people, as there were in Eastern Europe, as there were in Russia, the whole thing of the samizdat, you know, they're very brave people who will take that risk. And as we know, because of what the Iranians are doing with leading bloggers, it doesn't save you personally, but if you are one of those people who believes terribly that you have to get the message out, as the dissidents did, people like Bukovsky and all those people in Russia who realized that, yes, I'm putting myself into danger. China the same, they've been jailing bloggers and you know, sending them to the Laogai, which is the Chinese equivalent of the Gulag. But there are incredibly brave people who will take that risk. Now, I just feel this sheer mass, rather like the sheer mass of people who went through the wall 20 years ago, the sheer mass of information coming out of these societies will eventually, but I agree with you, the timeline is difficult, overwhelm these societies. And, you know, I mean, I get things, you know, about sort of hangings and stonings to death and everything in Iran, which has been going on for a very long time. Nobody knew about them. Now we do.
Okay, thank you. I think, I mean, it's 9 o'clock. I think we're pretty much done. I mean, do we think, just have a show of hands, do we think the coming down of the wall was a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I know what I think, but good thing, show of hands, but hands up those who think it was a good thing. Okay.
Is there a single dissident here?
Bad thing? The wall should have said no. Well, there we are, unanimity. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to